Dr. Ray Huml from Quintiles, and Dr. Huml will be talking on clinical trials readiness and the patient's roles in clinical trials readiness. Thank you, Ray.
Thanks, Dan. I'd like to also thank the FSH Society for being a cornerstone to my family. In addition to being a veterinarian and working at Quintiles for 16 years in clinical trials, I have 2 children with infantile onset FSH. I'd also like to thank Quintiles, who's a sponsor for this talk. When I first talked to the FSH Society, the fact that Quintiles runs clinical trials and runs more clinical trials than any of our competitors, I thought that I would be talking about kind of like the pros and cons of clinical trials. But after talking to June and others, we decided that since we're a little earlier in the stage of clinical trial development with FSH, that we would focus on natural history studies. So that'll be the topic of this. I also fall back to my experience in regulatory affairs, and we'll touch briefly on some regulatory updates that'll be important for patients with FSH and ultimate clinical trial development. So I think the first bullet point we already know, but a couple of things I would just want to kind of provide with you so we understand about where natural history studies come in as kind of the current state of affairs. So some of the clinical research that we face and the hurdles that can delay a care is that the molecular basis for FSHD is not completely worked out. It's a little difficult to define and measure the rate of change in a slowly progressing disease. There is a variability in the disease progression. There's differences in the genetic mode of transmission, so they're not quite all figured out. I think the existence of the various forms adds another layer of complexity, as well as the phenotypes that were discussed earlier. There's actually few patients available or eligible for clinical trials. The variability that's been mentioned before, and some of the preclinical animal model differences that we've seen. Very encouraging, and I think there's some significant progress, but still more needs to be done. So that's kind of where we're at. So I got this off the website. If you look up about clinical trials and tissue donation and things, and I just want to bring a couple of points to this group. One of them says that some of the studies do not require blood or tissue samples, but are natural history studies that monitor a person's FSH over time. So I think what we're coming at this is from a lot of different areas. Other speakers have talked about registries. Some folks, like Dr. Wagner, have mentioned on clinical trials and early preclinical trials. And this talk is going to be just on the natural history study. So what we're basically trying to do is monitor a person's FSHD over time to understand how the disease progresses, realizing all the complexities that we just mentioned on the previous slide. So what are they? In essence, a natural history study should not raise or does not raise ethical concerns where there's no adequate treatment, and the purpose is to gather information. And some of you may remember from your college days or looking up on the web about the Tuskegee study, where a natural history study was done in African-American men that had syphilis starting around 1932. And when a treatment became available in 1947, the natural history study still progressed, but they did not give the treatment to the people. So that raises a huge ethical concern about not doing that. So I just want to bring that up because I think it should be a distinction that the natural history study is not involving like a course of a therapy or against a placebo or an active treatment. So just to make kind of a differentiation on that, but also the fact that there are some ethical concerns about studying folks and their disease progression. So if you look at some definitions of natural history studies, I wanted to bring 2 to your attention. One is from the National Cancer Institute, and it said that it just basically follows a group of people over time who have or at the risk of developing a specific medical condition or disease, and that study collects health information to understand how the medical condition or disease develops, and that's ultimately so that how you can treat it. And the definition of natural history, which comes from rare diseases epidemiology, is the natural course of disease from immediately prior to its inception, progresses through the different phases to the point where it's ended and the patient's either cured, or disabled, or died. So these natural history studies, in essence, they track the disease over time, and they identify the demographic, genetic, and environmental and other variables that correlate with the disease and the outcomes. So some of the examples of natural history studies in MD would be one that's being done in conjunction with Duke University, where they look at clinical features, expression profiling, quality of life in infantile onset FSHD. And then there's another one on prospective natural history study of progression of subjects with Duchenne, MD. And we've actually talked about that primary outcome measure has been mentioned by previous speakers about the 6-minute walking distance, and that's an important objective measure that's been more and more well-defined, but used typically more in Duchenne. Then there's some older studies that have been mentioned already before, so I won't mention those before, but there have been some other studies that have been done with FSH and continue to do more. So these are very helpful to kind of provide the basis for that. So there is historical precedent. So some of the different tests that I've already mentioned have been mentioned by other speakers, so I won't go into those either, but a couple that are highlighted in red just to bring to your attention would be like the manual muscle testing, maximum voluntary isometric contraction testing, and people have actually had some slides on that before, so you can show you how it's kind of done. And the interesting thing about all of them is the studies can establish reliable and valid measures for the disease, not only the state and the progression, but you can use it as an outcome variable in a clinical trial. So that's kind of like the next step of where we're all headed with this. And it can provide guidelines for determining a sample size and duration of follow-up. And that gives you some details in here about this study. But basically just to tell you that, you basically need this information in order to move forward. So let me just kind of make sure that everybody understands that a registry study, which we talked about before, and we had an excellent example from the speaker from France, is not exactly the same as a natural history study. The registries do include communications to parents, patients, and participants and get information back. They can meet even a post-marketing commitment, like something by a regulatory agency, so either in the U.S. or in Europe. They can compile safety data, it's kind of long-term safety data. And just to make a mention that, so you kind of can connect the dots with me a little here, is Quintiles was actually awarded the National Registry for MD Studies from the Muscular Dystrophy Association. So they've had to, because of limitations in resources and funding, of course, they had to limit it to what they thought was the most severe forms of MD. So Duchenne and Becker's are two of the top ones. It's not yet been on FSH, but there is plans for FSH. Next on that. So just in summary on the natural history studies, there is a specific purpose. It's with the intention of describing that disease, and it's intended to be comprehensive and provide more detailed information than you could get otherwise. And basically the main reason is you want to get all this information together so that you can inform drug development, which Dr. Wagner had mentioned earlier before is where we want to all head. The marketing approvals require a design and the conduct of adequate and well-controlled studies based on a scientific foundation, including the knowledge of the natural history of the disease. And some groups, even like the Duchenne muscular dystrophy, has mentioned that they do not wish to use placebos in clinical trials because it's seen as unfair that if a drug can potentially offer promising treatment. But since you have to compare to see whether it's working or not, you have to have at least some baseline, and that's where potentially a natural history study could be used to be actually, if you will, a surrogate for the placebo arm. Because in general, as you all know, the rare diseases are poorly understood, and it's an important role for the natural history studies in rare disease drug development to facilitate the future, and that comes right from the FDA. So you've seen a similar slide to this with Dr. Wagner, but if you look where we put the natural history study course in here, and this is directly from the FDA, one of the slides that have been used by one of their speakers, I wanted to put in here just to show you that it's extremely important. And it enables both an understanding of the pathophysiology and the mechanism of action because there is a disparity in the difference in phenotypes and the differences between FSHD 1, 2, and the other mechanisms to try to get a handle on how all these complex things fit together. The ultimate aim is to get what's called an IND or an investigational new drug application, and that allows the process forward so that you can use a drug experimentally in people. And then the early phase clinical trial that has been mentioned before would be like Phase 1 and Phase 2. So Phase 1 is typically considered in healthy volunteers, but can be in patients. And then you want to try to see if it works and figure out the right dose in Phase 2. And then Phase 3 is usually a confirmatory trial, and FDA typically requires 2 large randomized trials to confirm what one said, to confirm it with the other, and then ultimately approval. The adequate and well-controlled studies have some certain requirements as per the Code of Federal Regulations. So they have to have a research goal and an objective and a valid comparison with the control. And it has to be the concurrent strongest control or historical, which is why the Duchenne community decided to try to push for use of a natural history study versus a placebo. You have to have an appropriate selection of subjects, and that requires things like biostatistical analysis, as well as to make sure that the right studies not only will maximize for the benefit of it, but also potentially would be the most that could be helped. You have to have a method of assignment to the treatment and controls and the employment of measures to minimize the bias. A lot of that comes with statistics and physician help. And then the other methods that are there as well. So where's the state of the union for this? Well, my background comes in regulatory affairs as well. I've worked in medical writing, regulatory affairs, and then for about 12 years at Quintiles, I worked in product risk-based investments. There is muscular dystrophy regulatory guidance in the industry. There's none currently for FSHD. There has been some draft guidance that's been promulgated for Duchenne muscular dystrophy and Becker's, and it's been available in Europe. So a concept paper was issued back in 2011, and draft guidance has been available since last year for them. I think it's interesting for FSHD because if you do read that, you'll find out that there's an awful lot of things in there that are applicable for both for FSHD patients as well. So even though it's specific for that disease, or more specific for that, it has many different parallels for that. And I thought that it might not be intuitive for everyone to kind of understand that or even to tease that out. So I wrote a paper that was published in the January Regulatory Affairs, and anybody that's interested, I have a few copies up here. Be glad to share it, or electronically if you don't want to carry it home on the plane. Another thing I think it's interesting for folks here is that the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy guidance that was mentioned by June on the first day during the early morning hours just came out in June of 2014. If you kind of want to get some of the highlights and how it might affect patients or someone in your own family, I published a paper that came out a couple weeks ago on that, and I'd be glad to share that with you. But the guidance that I'm talking about is basically a selection of natural history that's characterizing the clinical course of Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, including the scientific consensus on tools, instruments, and outcome measures, which is all that we're working on right now for FSH. And the most important thing about this is that since the FDA was started, they have not accepted patient advocacy group information to date. So there's never been one. This is the first one that's ever been done. And the first one that ever did it was in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And my personal opinion, and this is not on behalf of Quintiles or FSH Society, but my own personal opinion is I think this is great news because there is a lot of information that's been done with FSH, and I think that this could be spearheaded by a patient advocacy group. So this is something that potentially we could all influence individually, and I want to personally be a part of it as well. So it has that, and while though it's not yet formally adopted by the FDA and it's not clear which pieces will or will not be, I think this is really great news. Like I said, it just came out in June of this year, and I think that was part also because a paper that I published in January, I mentioned that one of the biggest concepts from an investment standpoint is that those companies that have FDA guidance and those companies that have more association with the FDA, those products usually have a higher risk of success for getting approved for use in patients. And with no specific guidance, it makes it more riskier, so it's harder for people to invest in it. But as molecular concepts evolve and as gene targets like the DUX4 that you've heard about in the last 2 days are becoming available, I think we're at a really great time now for future investment. And I think these guidances are really helpful. So in summary, I think that natural history studies are needed to enhance our understanding of FSH and its progression. They're part of the study continuum that we ultimately will need to lead to the conduct of clinical trials. They involve some sample taking, so it is possible that you may see blood, tissue, or urine to be asked for, or undergoing a certain diagnostic procedure like an MRI, CT, or ultrasound, or things that you've already heard about yesterday or today. But a registry, just to make sure, is not a natural history study, and it's not a clinical trial investigation. But I think that the FSH Society, as it's a key resource for my family, I think it can be a key resource for everyone in here to identify the ongoing natural history studies, and other studies can also be found at clinicaltrials.gov, which provide an overview of the acceptability for enrollment, and you can see them elsewhere online. The FDA has not issued formal guidance for industry on FSHD, but it has received, though not yet adopted, that draft guidance I mentioned to you from patient advocacy groups like the PPMD, and they advocate on patients with muscular dystrophy. Thank you very much.